Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the Banana Republics by Sam O'Nella. Sam O'Nella really covers a wide range of historical topics. Today we'll be talking about some Latin American history, which will be exciting. Before I get into it, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Alright, the Banana Republics.
Hey kids, do you like fashionable, high-quality apparel at an affordable price? Well, too bad, because that's not what we're talking about today. I'm gonna learn you all a thing or two about the real Banana Republics. Our story begins during the turn of the 20th century in Central and South America. Agriculture's kind of a big deal right now. You've got a ton of little plantations all over the place growing bananas, sugar, pineapples, that kind of thing. And they're doing alright for themselves, no big deal. But then refrigeration happened, and it changed everything. Because now produce could be kept fresh for way longer in transit, meaning the fruit companies could suddenly open up their business to the international market.
Absolutely. Now, sugar, it had been a cash crop for hundreds of years, right? A lot of the slave plantations throughout the Americas had been centered around producing sugar, which was a massive money maker. But now, especially with refrigeration, like they said, crops like pineapples, bananas in particular, they were able to be sold around the world. And that means there's a lot of money to be made. And that catches the eyes of a lot of international businessmen, especially in the United States.
Their biggest new trade partner being the United States. This massive opportunity gave rise to three main companies, known as the United Fruit Company, Cuyamel Fruit Company, and the Vaccaro Bros.
And I'll point out, by the way, you may or may not be familiar with these companies. United Fruit today is Chiquita Banana, and Vaccaro Bros, they became Standard Fruit, and today they're Dole, right? So these companies, they're still around today, though they've gone through some rebranding. We might see why actually during this video, but just keep in mind, these companies are still very much present in our lives and in the market, at least in the United States today.
By growing, shipping, and selling fruit, these three firms made just obscene amounts of money, a
Yep.
lot of which went towards buying out smaller family-owned farms and plantations. This allowed them to make even obscener amounts of money, until eventually the only competition that remained was each other. And then shit got real. The year is 1910. One of the companies I mentioned, Cuyamel, was doing most of its business in the country of Honduras, when the president of Honduras, Miguel Davila, decided to give a land grant to the Vaccaro Bros in exchange for helping to build some roadways. In doing so, they basically stole a bunch of Cuyamel's potential plantations and gave them to a competitor. So Samuel Zamuri, owner of Cuyamel, said to himself, "Dang, I hate those guys. If only there was some way for a guy like me to significantly influence the world around him for his own personal gain." Wait a minute, so he used
Right, exactly. So the money these guys were making gave them a lot of power, and in particular, a lot of political influence, right? This is an era, sort of the mid to late 1800s into the 1900s, where there were a lot of rich businessmen in the United States, and they exerted themselves politically throughout the world, right? Hawaii is a good example of this. The independent government of Hawaii was essentially brought down by a group of these businessmen who were making a lot of money on sugar in particular, but other crops and businesses in Hawaii, right? And the involvement of the United States government, it varied, right? Sometimes the United States government wasn't incredibly involved. It would usually get involved after enough time had passed. Sometimes there was tacit approval of these guys. Like, you know what, we're not gonna support you out in the open, but behind the scenes, sure. Sometimes there was open approval. I mean, I'm sure in this video we'll see a lot of blatant interference from the United States. And sometimes, for the most sort of crazy of these individuals, the United States government even said, okay, don't do that. But oftentimes for these types of guys, there was tacit approval, and even if there wasn't in the moment, the US government would usually eventually get on board because it either meant new territory, like in the case of Hawaii, or money, like in all of these cases, or at least political power.
a portion of his McDuck-esque fortune to hire a mercenary army, which he gave to one of his friends, former Honduran President Manuel Bonilla, and together, they overthrew the entire fucking government of Honduras. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should've called it Cuyamel. Anyway, Bonilla took power and gave very generous concessions to Cuyamel and United as thanks. But then America saw this, and they were like, hey, that's not very freedom of you, young man. To which Zemery replied, it's okay, we're gonna help this country succeed. After all, politics and business are essentially the same thing. While I suppose it's not our place to be policing the governments of other nations. Yeah,
Oh?
Still though, maybe. Oh, also? Nanners. Alright, I'm sold. Do what you want.
Yeah, so exactly. So we're talking early 1900s. We're getting into the time when the United States begins getting more and more involved in governments of foreign countries. But it's still building up to that high level of intervention we'll see throughout the 20th century. However, when you say, hey, there's money involved, we can make some cash, the US government is usually willing to go along with whatever these rich businessmen, these industrialists, whatever, what they want to achieve.
With their interests secured, the businesses continued to thrive and expand. But since they got cut so many breaks by the government, very little of their commerce actually ended up benefiting Honduras as a whole. In fact, the national debt of Honduras got so bad that the government ended up not being able to perform a lot of its functions. So
yeah, I mean, this is what we might call an extractive system, right? Like a lot of colonialism or imperialism, you're running this industry, this business that makes a lot of money. They were making tons of money growing and selling these fruits around the world. But, all the profits are being extracted back into these companies and largely back into the United States. The profits are not being absorbed by the people of the country. And it primarily doesn't go back to their benefit. They're working for low wages, under bad conditions, right? So this is an extractive industry.
Response, the three fruit companies stepped in and said, no worries, we got this, and decided to basically build the nation's infrastructure for them, including roads, railways, shipping lines, telegraphs, telephone lines, radio towers. They even switched the whole country off to the US dollar. Keep in mind, this wasn't out of the goodness of their hearts. It was mostly just to make their own businesses function more efficiently.
Yeah, I'm glad he said it, because that's exactly what I was going to say as well. You're not doing this to benefit the people. There may have been some knock-on positive effect in some cases, but these companies are doing this to make business flow, right? The nanners must flow. They want to be able to grow, produce, transport these fruits a lot more efficiently. And so that sometimes means building infrastructure.
But it was helpful either way. Anyway, now, not only did they have total power over their
I will say, we have a lot of examples of infrastructure projects done by these companies that ended up getting a lot of their employees killed, right? You're talking about building railroads and telegraph lines through a lot of fairly thick jungles and forests, pretty bad conditions, pretty dangerous. So you've got a lot of examples from a lot of these different businessmen. You can look to Henry Ford in particular, actually, where they tried to build towns or cities or infrastructure, and it may or may not have been successful, but they end up getting a lot of people killed in the process, largely from disease.
Efficiently, but it was helpful either way. Anyway, now, not only did they have total power over their plantations, but also a monopoly over nearly every major industry in the country.
Right, exactly. So that's the other thing, right? They're building this infrastructure in order to help their business. But also, it allows them to have a monopoly over all the services that the country can provide. Now, I mean, they already controlled a lot of the country's politics. Now they essentially completely control the country.
Many other Central American nations soon followed this pattern, creating a corrupt sort of symbiosis whereby the fruit companies get huge tax breaks and land grants in exchange for a modernized infrastructure and payoffs to the rich minority.
Right, exactly. That last part is key. Your average Guatemalan or Honduran, they may have been forced to work in these horrible conditions for low pay, but a group of elites, few but powerful at the top, were able to take a lot of bribe money, essentially, and live in good conditions themselves if they agreed to keep providing the tax cuts and the land and whatever these companies wanted.
And so, the Banana Republics were born. Sounds like a pretty sweet gig, right? And it was. For the upper 5% of the
Right.
populations who happen to hold some direct share in the plantations or shipping lines.
Yeah.
For your average Jose, though, life mostly consisted of working on land that wasn't even theirs in exchange for dirt poor wages. So that's how things were for like a decade and a half. At some point, Koyamel was bought out by United, but then Zamore became the owner of the whole thing, somehow, and the Vaccaro company was renamed as Standard Fruit.
Yep.
Then one day,
Then
in
Dole.
1944, the country of Guatemala had a democratic revolution, and the newly elected leader, Juan Jose Arevalo, wasn't happy with how the companies treated his people.
Understandably so.
So he implemented several reforms, like a minimum wage law and universal suffrage, and while the populace got
Nothing too crazy. Suffrage, minimum wage, all pretty moderate stuff.
a lot of benefit out of this, United Fruit most certainly did not, because more rights for their workers means less profits for the business as a whole. Then Guatemala got a new president, Jacobo Arbenz, and he continued these reforms. And United continued to get the metaphorical shaft until finally, in 1953, they decided to go to the USA for help. Oh, Eisenhower.
Yeah, Arbenz continued those reforms, did some land reform in particular, which was especially offensive to these companies, right? Essentially trying to strip some of the power away from them and give it back to the people of Guatemala, in terms of earning a higher wage or maybe owning some land or being able to vote, having some influence on their country's politics, right? This is sort of a big moment. You're seeing this democratic revolution, right? The voice of the people is being heard. Now, of course, that's not a good thing for these companies or for the United States, because when democracy happens in Guatemala, that means they're making less money, right? That's a problem from them.
Or, yo, what's up? This Jacobo guy, he's making us pay minimum wages. Well, that doesn't sound very good for business. That's not all, though. He's also taking our unused land and giving it back to the people. Does that sound familiar? Oh, dear. You don't think. By the way it's looking, Dwight, I'd say he's a dirty, oh god, collectivizing, no, commie.
Uh-oh.
Commie! Commie! Yeah, go get him, Dwight.
Oh my. Yeah, pretty accurate representation of what goes down, right? One of the reasons the United States gets involved, because remember, we've jumped a couple decades, right? We started in the early 1900s, when it's largely these fruit companies leading the way, and the United States government, if they intervene, it's mostly sort of behind the scenes, tacit. Now we've gotten to a point in the 1950s where the Cold War is in full swing. The United States is willing to intervene anywhere, to protect its business interests, but if there's the excuse of communism they can use, they'll get in there. Now, Arbenz was not a communist, right? But he was doing some sort of left-wing type reforms. Close enough. Let's get in there. Let's overthrow him.
Holy shit, you actually did it. World Star! And from that point onward, Guatemala was ruled by a series of US-backed dictatorships, all the way up until 1996.
Yeah, and so this is one of many of these types of situations, right? You have a long list of different US-backed coups around the world. Of course, we're talking about Latin America here, and essentially the trend is the same, right? A democratic revolution or democratic election happens. The people vote on a leader who tries some, anywhere from radical to mild left-wing policies, especially redistributing land, basically stripping profits away from these American companies. And then the United States, usually through the aegis of the CIA, backs a coup or directly performs a coup, either removing or killing the democratically elected leader of that country and putting in power a, right-wing to fascist authoritarian dictator, right? We see this thing repeated throughout many of the countries of Latin America. This is one of many examples. Though it is sort of a classic example, right? This one really checks all the boxes.
Kind of situation happened in several other places and times as well.
Yep.
Almost always driven by some combination of red fear and yellow love. I won't give any more details for the sake of time, but that doesn't mean they weren't big deals. So you might be wondering, where did these companies go? Surely the Clan of Banana Shenanigans can't still be around today.
You'd think, wouldn't you?
Well, that's where you're wrong. They're still in operation, just under different names. Standard Fruit changed their name in 1991 to become none other than Dole Fruit Company. When I was a kid, I used to play a lot of Super Monkey Ball, and I used to wonder, what kind of cruel tyrant would just stick an ape in a ball for their own amusement? Well, now I know.
Yeah, as I was saying earlier, these companies didn't go away. They've simply rebranded because they got up to some shady stuff, and they're still a big part of our lives and our economy. Right? So the same companies who backed all of these coups and massacres and etc., they're still in operation today. And of course, a lot of these companies, and you can expand outwards, not just from the fruit companies, of course, but a lot of multinational corporations are still getting up to a lot of violent shenanigans today. If you just look around the world, it's not hard to find.
Those bastards. As for United, one day in 1976, their CEO decided he couldn't take the heat anymore, so he jumped out the fucking window.
Jesus.
That's a real thing, look it up. Then some other guy bought the company and renamed it to, drumroll please, Chiquita Banana.
Yep.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen. The face you once knew as an innocent, fun-loving dancer slash fruit merchant is actually a ruthless tyrant who overthrows democracies and undermines basic human rights for her own profit. Anyway, that's all for today. Till next time, I'm Salmonella, and thank you for watching.
Alrighty. Another good Salmonella video. This was an interesting one. We got into some real sort of political history topics. Some good stuff. I definitely enjoyed this one. I always enjoy his videos. They're always entertaining, fascinating. If you guys like this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, links down below, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.